In the Victorian age, the UK led the world in building railways. It wasn't an invention that changed the world. But by the 1980s, the state-owned British Rail was the butt of jokes, stale sandwiches, declining passengers and closed lines. The railways just couldn't compete with the convenience and lower cost of motorway Britain. Yet even the great free marketeer Mrs Thatcher didn't dare to privatise British Rail. She believed it was a step too far. But in 1993, under John Major, British Rail was privatised and broken up into many smaller units. It was hoped that privatisation would cut costs, improve competition and lead to better services. And in the years following privatisation, passenger figures did actually increase dramatically. It was part of a European-wide boom in train travel, a response to congested roads and higher economic growth, but also private companies successfully attracting new customers. However, despite rising passenger numbers, cracks in the model of privatisation soon started to appear. The fragmentation of a network meant there was no guiding hand, no overall vision. The Hatfield crash of 2000, due to poorly maintained track, set off panic, with Railtrack imposing speed restrictions and undergoing hasty maintenance. The disaster led to the demise of Railtrack and its effective nationalisation. Government subsidy to the rail industry soared due to the problems of creaking infrastructure, though it is worth mentioning that UK rail safety is one of the best in Europe and significantly safer than road transport. Passenger numbers have increased since 1993, but privatisation failed to keep a lid on rising costs, and as a result passengers have witnessed 2 decades of above-inflation increases in prices. It means the UK is one of the most expensive places in Europe to travel by train. Though we'll look at this in more detail because the question is not as straightforward as it first appears. Now, the basic model of privatisation is franchising, with companies bidding for the right to run a service. However, the fragmentation of a network has only created an illusion of competition. The FT report an internal government document from the time where they admitted that local monopolies were a political trick to gain local approval. It was pretend capitalism. The esteemed railway writer Christian Woolmar points out that the basic problem of rail privatisation is that railways is a natural monopoly. It requires considerable public investment and is an essential public services. Now, it is true that railways are primarily used by higher income commuters. Hardly a surprise given the price of tickets. But when railways fail, everyone suffers more road congestion and lost productivity. Even the Tory minister Sir Malcolm Rifkind admitted that their chosen model of privatisation was irrational, bad economics and bad business sense. Many European countries have looked at the UK's bold privatisation experiment, but it is telling that no one has wanted to follow the UK's model. One of the few profitable rail routes in the UK is the East Coast Main Line between London and Edinburgh, but since privatisation, 3 private companies have failed, causing the government to have to step in and run it directly. In 2009, after the first failure, the state-owned East Coast franchise was successful, paying over £1 billion in premium payments to the government, benefiting taxpayers. But despite its success, in 2015 it was re-privatised, this time run by Virgin and Stagecoach. But even Richard Branson couldn't work his magic, and in 2018 Stagecoach and Virgin walked away, claiming it was too unprofitable. And of course it's not just the East Coast Main Line. We've seen failures in Northern, Scottish Rail and Welsh Railways, to name but a few. Going back to the East Coast Main Line, the LNER has seen a rapid recovery since the COVID-induced fall in traffic numbers. It outperformed its West Coast mainline rival, showing that state-owned companies can be successful in attracting customers too. One of the paradoxes of privatisation, at least for UK's model, is that in a way it's made the railways even more political than before privatisation. We've seen more government intervention, more government regulation, more government restrictions on what private firms can do. And it means that so many decisions are now very political. Already 40% of passenger journeys are now run by state-owned railway companies, and the infrastructure is wholly owned by Network Rail, a state-owned company. A significant problem for the UK railways, whatever the ownership, is a rise in costs. The McNulty report argued that UK railways were around 34% more expensive than European counterparts. There's many reasons for this. One is that the relatively short franchises gave little incentive for companies to invest in training staff or improving services. This contrasts to, say, the Dutch model of competitive tendering, which was more successful in reducing running costs. The implication of these higher costs of running has been an increase in state subsidies. In 2018-19, net government support for the railways was £7 billion, double the pre-privatisation amount in real terms. However, it was the COVID collapse in passenger numbers which saw government costs soar. Between April 2020 and March 2023, the railway system cost the public purse more than £52 billion. Given this huge level of state support, the profitability of private companies is controversial. For example, in the year ending 2022 to 23, rolling stock companies, own the trains, paid out £410 million to shareholders in dividends. Their profit margins rose 41%. The ownership of the rolling stock is the most profitable part of a network, and this is one criticism of a privatisation structure, is that there's a cherry picking of the profitable parts of the network, and when private companies fail, the government have to step in. The RMT claims that privatisation has caused leakages from the rail network in the tune of around £1.2 billion a year in terms of dividends and administration costs. The Grant Shapps plan for British Rail claim there is a potential £1.5 billion a year potential savings. Now, the profitability of the railways is somewhat disputed. Full fact point to evidence that the train companies are running at a profit margin of around 4%. And if that's the case, renationalisation is not going to be a magic bullet in terms of lowering prices. Now, whilst passengers have definitely seen rising prices, how does it compare to the rest of the world? Is the UK really more expensive? Well, if you use a basic buy a ticket on the day of travel, UK prices are definitely one of the most expensive in Europe, if not the whole world. However, privatisation did encourage a more complex dynamic pricing strategy, which encouraged people to buy in advance. And if we look at advanced tickets, the difference in price is much less significant, and the UK is often in the middle of the pack. I think the motto of travelling by train in the UK is try buy in advance. However, if we look at the share of income spent by a typical commuter on a season ticket, the UK is again one of the most expensive places in Europe. But whatever the price of UK tickets, I think most customers can agree that it's become very complicated and bewildering to buy the cheapest ticket. And this highlights an issue behind the fragmented private system. There's a lack of overall national coordination and strategy. For all its faults, British Rail could see the overall picture of a whole rail system. Post-privatisation, there's been an increase in complexity and fragmentation, with responsibility often lacking. This was seen in the Hatfield crash of 2000, but also the timetabling disaster of 2018, when trains just didn't turn up. Network Rail blamed train operating companies blamed Network Rail, and everyone seemed to blame the rail minister Chris Gayling, who claimed it was nothing to do with him. Privatisation created a circular chain of passing the buck. Now, one of the few successes of privatisation has been in freight. Freight travel has increased 80% since 1993, but also has seen a fall in real cost. A reflection that competition has been easier to introduce in this sector of the market. Also, amidst all this doom and gloom, it is worth bearing in mind that the UK is one of the few countries in Europe who are reopening lines, opening new train stations, and seeing quite good passenger growth. For example, Chiltern Railways reopened a route from Birmingham and Oxford to London Marylebone, and Chiltern Railways received considerable praise for the quality of its service. Privatisation has been a mixed bag. Not every company has been a failure, but the overall picture has been one of disappointment and too many failures. Now, the cause of rail privatisation has not been helped by HS2, a large, ambitious project which has taken a big share of government investment in the railways. With its recent part cancellation, it's likely to give relatively low returns, and there were potentially much better investments. For example, electrifying the network or investing in small local regional services which would improve connection to big cities. To give a comparison, the state-owned India Rail has recently electrified 45% of its very extensive network in just 5 years, whilst UK electrification has run at a snail's pace and incurred very high costs. And this reflects a general problem that it's just very expensive to build infrastructure in the UK. So as we can see, there's a very good reason why rail privatisation was left to the last. It was the most difficult. Like water, it's an important public service, a natural monopoly, and requires significant investment. Whilst increasing competition could play a role in increasing efficiency, the way that UK's privatised the network has meant we've seen very little effective competition, but ended up with a lot of the costs of private monopolies. It's no surprise that no one else followed the UK model of privatisation. Now, to understand better some of the failings of the rail network, this video on HS2 goes into more detail on why it proved an inefficient use of investment.